My name is David Petrino. I am the Director of Rehabilitation Innovation for the Mount Sinai Health System in New York.
Cool. So I'm kind of curious, how does an Aussie from Perth make his way to Midtown Manhattan?
My background is I'm a physiotherapist / physical therapist in this part of the world. And I did a PhD in neuroscience. I was really interested in trying to understand new technologies and techniques for treating stroke patients at the time. And so I went down a bit of a rabbit hole of understanding the neurobiology of motor control. When I finished my PhD, really the only option open for me to continue this sort of academic work was in Boston. So I packed my bags, moved over to Boston, spent a couple of years working at Harvard and MIT. And while I was there, I started, making some connections at NYU and learned about some projects that I wanted to get involved in there. Moved over to NYU, completed another postdoctoral fellowship. And at that point, I sort of really wanted to do my own thing. So I started my own lab, first at Cornell, and then moved to Mount Sinai, where I took on a fairly risky role. Director of Rehab Innovation doesn't really exist anywhere else. And, the mission was, there's a whole bunch of technologies that could potentially help people that just aren't getting adopted. I think it's worth mentioning that a big frustration of mine in academia was just how slow it took to do anything, and how by the time you do a perfectly controlled trial, the results of your study are so specified that they don't really mean anything. It's like, oh, we can help 0.1% of the population, given how strict our inclusion and exclusion criteria were. So I wanted to do something that was more pragmatic, more practical. And so we started this center with that exactly in mind. We were going to develop new technologies. We were going to develop new therapies. And that has been a really exciting role for me for the last 5 years. And, as it turns out, given the level of expertise and the diversity of expertise that I've been able and fortunate enough to bring around me, it just happens to be a really good role to be in when there's a global pandemic going on, because everyone wants to help. And suddenly I had all of these tools at my disposal to be able to just mobilize when things got bad.
Cool. So when did you start this specific clinic at Mount Sinai?
So we started working with long COVID patients probably May of 2020. They got on our radar around April because early March of 2020, we launched a remote patient monitoring app for people with acute COVID. We wanted to monitor them, make sure that they were safe in the home, because what was happening in New York when the surge was bad was people were getting COVID symptoms, going to the hospital. They were being told, look, we don't have beds and you're not sick enough. Go home and come back if you're worse, which is a really terrifying thing to say to someone who is sick with an unknown illness with an unknown disease course. How much sicker at what point do I come back? So we saw this happening. My team has a lot of expertise in remote patient monitoring. So we developed an app in something like 24 to 36 hours, launched it. We said, here's a hotline. If you're having symptoms, call this number. If you're being discharged from a medical facility, call this number. We'll onboard you and we'll track you every single day to make sure that you're doing okay. And we started doing that, and pretty soon we had hundreds and then thousands of people on the app being monitored. And it was around April, mid-April, late April, we started seeing this cluster of people who were expressing different symptoms. They were still reporting diligently on the app, but the symptoms had changed from, headache and fever and chills and everything, you know, shortness of breath and cough. Now they were talking about dizziness and fatigue, and I can't seem to exercise the way I used to. And, you know, there's something about this that I can't shake, and my heart feels like it's beating out of its chest. And, you know, my arms are tingling, my feet are going blue, you know, all of these very odd symptoms. But it was striking. And what was immediately striking to me was just how similar all of these, how random these accounts were, but really similar. So it's like, hey, what disease process has tingling feet and, you know, blue hands, and but everyone's reporting the same thing. So that was when we formed a little group of individuals who have experience dealing with disorders of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system being this part of your nervous system that does all of the things that you usually don't need to think about, you know, when you should feel hot, when you should feel cold, when you should sweat, when your heart should beat, when you should breathe. And when that gets disordered, that's when all of these odd symptoms start to emerge. Now, you know, 18 months or however many months on, I've stopped counting, I still don't feel comfortable saying that this is absolutely, definitely dysautonomia, but I will say that the symptoms are dysautonomia-like, you know, secondary to a viral infection. So, you know, we started managing in April of 2020. We formalized the clinic in May of 2020, and we've been seeing patients ever since.
So I actually meant, like, when did you move to Mount Sinai? But thank you for that.
Hopefully you can use
still getting background.
Yeah. So I moved to Mount Sinai in, I want to say April of 2016. That sounds about right. Or it might have been 2017. God, that's embarrassing. I don't even know. But should I verify that?
It would be helpful if you can remember later. And so you were at Weill Cornell for a while, and then moved to, do you pronounce it Weill?
Weill Cornell. Okay. Yeah.
Right. And do you know Tom Oxford there? You must have.
Oxley? Tom Oxley?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he's at Sinai. We're good friends. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm actually running his Synchron trial. So we should be getting started any day now on the first in human clinical trial in the United States. So really exciting stuff.
Exciting days for sure. And so when you were studying to be a physio in Perth, I'm imagining.
Yep.
Yeah. Did you kind of ever expect to be moving into a fairly niche kind of area? Or?
Absolutely not. No. When I finished my physio degree, I said no more study, and research sucks, and I don't want to do it. And then I got out in the field and started working, and I got really bothered by how non-evidence-based we were. You know, we would just do stuff, and when you actually read into all the stuff we were doing, there wasn't a whole lot of evidence for it. And I got pretty fixated on that, and I wanted to, you know, I figured at that point, I guess this was just being way too young. I think I was 23, maybe 24 at the time. And I was like, come on, surely it should be easy to just, you know, solve one problem. Why does this therapy work better than this therapy? You know, and that was when I got into this rabbit hole of PhD research, and I realized that nothing was simple and everything was more and more complicated. And then even then, when I finished my PhD and I got offered a postdoc in Boston, I was like, okay, a couple more years, and then I'll go back to being a clinician, because I'll have a lot more wisdom at that point. And you know, you just keep going, you keep spiraling, and more questions keep emerging. And then I guess, you know, at some point in my research career, I started to really get frustrated about impact. And I think the reason I was fortunate enough to have that sort of crisis was because there are very few, clinician researchers are a fairly rare breed. And I think even more to the point, physiotherapist, physical therapist researchers are even more of a rare breed. And we tend to, as clinicians, be the more practical sort. With physician researchers, there's a little bit of distance between you and the patient. There's a little bit more in terms of the protocols you need to follow. Whereas physical therapists are the ones who, they'll get down and dirty with the patient. They will work with them every day. They'll get them walking. They're the ones who are sort of in the trenches. And pairing that level of pragmatism, where you've got to be like, well, this doesn't work, so I'm going to do this, and so on and so forth, with research doesn't happen very often. And I think because of that, I was just in this position to be really frustrated, frankly, by the whole system. And I was like, well, I've been doing this for almost 10 years now. Like, how much clinical practice have I actually influenced? And I remember there was a particular really self-effacing moment where I was working in a brain-computer interface lab, which is a technology where it records brain activity, and you use that brain activity to control something, whether it be a robot or a computer game or whatever the case may be. And at the time, I was working on a Department of Defense contract, and we were working with non-human primates, and we were working with very advanced technology, and we hit our final deliverable on the project. And I remember the principal investigator, the guy whose lab it was that I was working for, comes, dancing into the lab and says, "We've just cured paralysis." And everyone was cheering. Everyone was like caught up in the excitement. And I was sitting there going, "No, we haven't, you idiot." Like, we are 25 years from meaningful translation of this, and anything could be happening in those 25 years. And not having a clinical perspective, I saw how damaging it was, right down to what a waste of money, what a waste of animals, what a waste of everything if you don't have someone with a clear clinical objective in mind, a mission to help people, as opposed to a mission of like, where's my next grant coming from? What, how do I inch this like little research career forward that doesn't have anything to do with helping people. It just has to do with keeping my lab funded, keeping the lights on. That's destructive. And so, that was kind of my journey along that point.
Cool. Are you able to tilt your screen just a little bit so your head's at the top of the screen? Yeah, that's cool. That's awesome. When did you finish your undergraduate degree?
I finished my undergrad in 2004.
Okay, so it's been almost a couple of decades that you've been in the allied workforce.
Yeah, if you say it like that, sure. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just getting rid of my Bloomberg screen, just popped up. So just going back to the early days of 2020, I was actually in New York City until the first week of March. I'm glad I got the hell out of there then, because I think if I stayed a few days more longer, I might have been in trouble. What was it like back in March 2020 there?
It was grim. It was. I remember going into the lab every day, and we had a countdown for the number of days before we ran out of beds, and that was something that we were just managing with my team while we were testing out clever ways of turning BiPAP machines into ventilators, building our own ventilators, building a remote patient monitoring app to track acutely ill patients, chasing down PPE. I was meeting people on the street who had boxes of 10, you know, N95s, and I was immediately rushing that off to whichever friend at whichever hospital needed it the most. I remember, you know, we were like, everyone in the lab was like re-upping their knowledge on how to run ventilators because it's been a few years, but we were told we're going to get called in, we're going to have to do this sort of thing. There was just all sorts of crazy stuff going on in the early phase of the pandemic, you know, where we were just trying to prepare. Then everything hit, and it was just, you know, really chaotic for a while. I mean, we were trying to manage thousands of patients, trying to make sure that everyone gets called every single day. We were dropping off pulse oximeters to patients' homes. You know, I remember one day being with an ex-cop who was the ex-homicide detective was driving the van around, and we get to a house in the Bronx, and he's like, "Oh, this used to be my beat. This is like where all the homicides happen. You can't go in there." And I was like, "Well, we got to deliver like 5 oximeters and some medicine." And he was just like, "All right, I'll go in with you." And you know, like that was that. But it was just, these were the things we had to do because people were really struggling. And, you know, in that particular case, there's someone with a spinal cord injury in there that needed her medicine, and I wasn't not going to give her medicine, you know. And so it was just crazy stuff like that happening all through the city. And on top of it all, just the pure like atmosphere of doing all of that driving with no other cars on the road whatsoever, you know, driving down Madison Avenue and being the only car for 60 blocks is kind of just a crazy situation all around.
Well, now do you feel like you're kind of taking care of the aftermath of that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like, you know, we've had one pandemic end, and we've got this new pandemic of people with persistent symptoms. I think that with all of the literature that we've had for 100 years, this is something that we probably should have expected, you know, this post-viral illness emerging in a percentage of the population. I think that in, you know, even if you go back to sort of Spanish flu, you can find 100-year-old journal articles about, you know, this sort of cluster of people who were then completely debilitated and extremely fatigued post Spanish flu. And so, yeah, I feel like it's definitely a bit of a change in gears. We're not complete desperation mode anymore. We have things like PPE and, you know, hand sanitizer again, which is wonderful. So we're able to run a clinic functionally. We don't have a lot of fear about bringing people into the clinic anymore. So, you know, certain things have eased off, but at the same time, there's a lot of need right now.
Yeah. Who are your typical patients that you were helping before COVID? Can you sort of describe your clientele essentially?
Yeah, so pre-COVID, I run 3 different clinical and research, they're hybrid clinical research centers. One is called the Abilities Research Center. It's focused entirely on helping individuals with neurological conditions get access to the best technologies that we can find. So exoskeletal robotics, virtual reality, augmented reality, brain stimulation, brain implants, if you're talking to Dr. Oxley, all these sorts of you know, novel technologies. And the individuals that we typically work with are people with spinal cord injury, stroke, traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's, ALS, you know, chronic neurological conditions is typically what we work with. We then run a center called the Charles Lazarus Children's Abilities Center, which is a very similar center, except it's focused on pediatrics. So it's just getting the best technologies in to help kids. And then the final center is called Performance 360, and it's actually focused on high-performing individuals. So we work with high-performance athletes, the Brooklyn Nets, US Olympic team, Red Bull and their high-performance division. So we both work with and train these high performers, as well as study them and try and understand, how they do the things that they do and how we can help them do better. So we do get the whole range in non-COVID times. And for us, we view it as a strength. It really helps us to understand human performance from all angles and every spectrum. And for me, that's a great thing.
Yeah, where I'm just trying to remember where Mount Sinai is in Manhattan. In my head, it's Midtown, but sort of around the 70s.
So Mount Sinai Health System's actually 5 hospitals and a few hundred clinics, ambulatory clinics. So it can be a lot of places to a lot of people. I'm typically sort of traveling between 2 locations. One is the Mount Sinai Hospital, which is the main hospital. It's on the Upper East Side, up in the 90s, 98th and Madison. And that's the oldest. It's been there, 120 years, and it's been serving the community there for a long time. And then the other location I work at is the Union Square location. So it's right there, 10 Union Square East in New York.
Awesome. Did you get COVID yourself?
I did not, or at least I never tested positive for antibodies or PCR. I did have probably the very common New York experience of feeling extremely fatigued and feverish for a week and not knowing what was happening. And I remember that it was like first week of March, and I had just gotten back from Spain, which, if you remember, was one of the places to really kind of explode in the early days. And I remember getting back, and it was still at the time when we were like, COVID won't be bad. COVID, it might come to US, but it won't be a big deal. And I remember just feeling terrible for a week, and I was like, this is jet lag, it's fine, I'll ride it out. And then things started escalating, and I kind of just forgot about those symptoms. But if I ever had COVID, that was it. But I don't know that I did. And the PCR tests weren't available then. Antibody tests are woefully inaccurate. So your guess is as good as mine, I would say.
Yeah, I'm probably too early to be psychosomatic. So can you tell me a little bit about the post-COVID patients you're seeing now? What do they look like? Are you able to sort of paint a verbal picture of your typical patient?
Yeah, and I'll throw in a caveat that this is typical for New York City, because I really want to point out that we have some really wonderful collaborators all over the world, and what is typical in New York is not what is typical in Brazil. And so, yeah, the big caveat is this is not epidemiology. This is just the cohort we're seeing at New York, which is riddled with health disparities and and a need for us to dig deeper into the community and understand a lot more cases that are occurring. But what we're seeing is a median age of 42. About 70% of the patients who come to us are women, and a vast majority of them, I'd say a disproportionate majority of them, are previously fit and healthy. So I'd say it's about 50-50 to people who had like some sort of significant medical history versus just fit and healthy and used to run marathons and keeps in good shape, and all of these sorts of things. And so that's been an interesting feature to see. And then 96% of our cohort did not get hospitalized with COVID. So they had COVID, but it was not, it did not, get to the stage where they needed to be hospitalized. I draw the line at saying not severe. I think a lot of them had quite a severe experience, but none of them were, very few of them were hospitalized.
Do you sort of feel as though there's an element of PTSD as well, where people who are really, worried about their likelihood of survival, the really severe dyspnea, and I'm just wondering, because there must be a lot of dimensions to this, and there are obviously very significant physical things that are going on, but there are probably some emotional and psychological as well. I'm just wondering how you see that whole kind of landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think that no one's gotten out of 2020 unscathed when it comes to trauma, anxiety, and emotional turmoil. I would say, however, that if trauma and emotion and fear were a predictor of who's going to go on to get long COVID, we would see a lot more severe cases going on to get long COVID, and that is not the case. So these are individuals, again, these are individuals who are not hospitalized. A common narrative, in fact, is, yeah, I got it, I was fine, I was more or less asymptomatic, and I didn't think there was anything to worry about. And then 2 weeks after my symptoms went away, I got hit with this, So, when we think about the narratives that are coming through, and now at this point we've spoken to over 1,300 people who are exhibiting these sorts of symptoms, hearing about trauma, is not showing up as a as something that we would predict is causing or exacerbating symptoms. When we sample the entire population, incidents of things like pre-existing anxiety or depression sit around 15 to 20% in the cohort, which is lower than the general population. And we even did a quick screen on PTSD in the cohort, and again, 10 to 15% scored, marginally that they feel as though they had experienced trauma that is having a long-lasting effect, but not in a way that would make us think that this cohort is riddled with PTSD or any sort of emotional problem that would be affecting their symptoms.
Yeah, and I just want to put it out there that I wasn't at all assuming that many of your patients have conversion disorder or anything like that.
Oh, no.
But I also am curious too, because I think in one aspect of the stuff that I've done has been looking at the autopsy research, and then that's obviously a very distinct group, because most of those that have been autopsied have died from COVID as opposed to died of something else, but had COVID at some time point. So you get a very different sort of presentation, if you like. But yeah, this, the question still is it the virus doing this? Is it the immune response to the virus? What is the underlying biological mechanism for the pathophysiology that we're now dealing with? And it feels like, there's obviously a group of patients who were on vents and they've got damage because of that, and they've got post ICU, syndrome or whatever, and we know about all those things to some extent, but it's more of the unknowns, like why why do certain people still have anosmia, more than a year after their acute infection? Why are we getting these bizarre tachycardias and metabolic disturbances? Do you have any sort of thoughts on whether there are certain baskets that certain patients might fit into, or multiple baskets?
Yeah, so there's about 25 questions in there, but let's build this out. So when we started seeing these patients and started treating these patients, and this is before the NIH or CDC had put on their pants, we were managing these patients and looking after them. And so before PASC was a thing, we spoke to a number of patient-led groups, and we said, what are we going to call this thing medically? Because long haul COVID, we've heard long COVID appears to be the most prominent patient-led term, and I typically use long COVID when I'm speaking to anyone but my team, because it's it's the thing that's stuck. It's the most approachable. The problem with it, however, from our point of view, is it's a patient-owned term, which means that I've seen many patients who don't necessarily align with what I would call long COVID. And what I mean by that is they had COVID, their lungs got damaged, they now have persistent symptoms of COVID, but they need pulmonary rehabilitation. They don't have long COVID in all of the symptoms that we were discussing. And now I'm never in a million years going to say, hey, you don't have long COVID, because it's a patient-owned term and it's a patient-led term. And if they say they have long COVID, they have long COVID. They have persistent symptoms of COVID, and that's long COVID to them. So now the reason that becomes tricky is if a patient with PICS, with post-ICU syndrome, comes to me and says, fatigue, I have extreme fatigue, I'm going to work with that patient much differently to address their fatigue than I am with a patient who comes to me who has the classic long COVID presentation and has fatigue. Two absolutely different causes of fatigue that require different management. But both of these patients could say that they have long COVID. So we do need to sort of pass this out. Now, I really like to keep things simple. And so initially when we were working with the Center for Post-COVID Care, I said to Zizhan Chen, who's the director of the Center for Post-COVID Care at Mount Sinai, hey, here's what we're going to do. If you're examining someone and they've got a bunch of symptoms, and you can scan them, take their blood, look at their organs, and say, this is the proximate cause of your symptoms. This is it. We know what this is, and it's because of COVID, but we can see it. It's on a scan. You take them. If you have someone showing up with a laundry bag of symptoms and you can't see a single thing on their scan that would explain all of these symptoms, that to me is what we're going to call post-acute COVID syndrome, PACS. And that was the term we coined in April, and we said we're calling it PACS, and they'll come to us, and off we go. And then as we started to dig in more, of course, we started to see in Zizhan's team, there's PICS, there's post-ICU syndrome, there's acute kidney disease, there's cardiac damage, there's lung damage, there's, you name it. This is a multi-system condition, and there was all sorts of different damages going on. And we've, Zizhan has been doing a phenomenal job of cataloging these things and tracking these things and providing good, evidence-based care for all of these, what the NIH has now called post-acute sequelae of COVID. So all the medically explainable phenomenon are being managed, and we were staying with this other group of people. Now, as we've been trying to manage them, initially, what we did was symptom management. So we, again, thankfully, because my job is all about dealing with novel things, novel conditions, and novel treatments, I've got a really amazing team around me, and a lot of my team was really, they well versed in treating conditions exactly like this. I have a cardiologist who specializes precisely in how viruses affect the heart, and she works specifically with a group of individuals who get dysautonomia and POTS as a result of a genetic condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I have a phenomenal PT, DPT, so a doctor of physical therapy, and she is focused entirely on, treating people who have post-concussion syndrome. Again, something that looks very, very similar. You've got cognitive deficits, you've got heart palpitations, you've got difficulty with exercise and exertion, really similar cohort there as well. A nutritionist who really specializes with intuitive eating and helping people find food sensitivities and eat healthy, eat healthily. And we've got a couple of physiatrists working with us, a bunch more, a physical therapist who's world-renowned in respiratory medicine. So all of this team came together, and we started managing symptoms, and we started putting together things that would, hopefully help this patient cohort. From my performance center, we had a former naval special ops guy who does breath work, popping his head in and saying, you know what, I worked with a lot of fighter pilots, and this looks like hypocapnia, low CO2. Let me build out a breathwork protocol that treats that. So we started getting patients on that. Their symptoms started getting an edge taken off. We followed up with measurement. Sure enough, a large proportion of our patients were hypocapnic. So we were really just taking breadcrumbs, but we were being very reactive. We weren't necessarily pinning down the actual pathophysiology underpinnings. We then started working with a brilliant immunologist, Akiko Iwasaki. She's out at Yale University. And, she's been publishing some phenomenal work showing that individuals with persistent COVID symptoms are expressing a lot of autoantibodies, meaning antibodies that are attacking native tissues within your body, which is what a lot of people with autoimmunity look like. And so, I think right now, and we've been working with Akiko a lot, and we're trying to tighten up this data set and see if we can really start to verify some of these findings with a bit more granularity. But it's still entirely possible that PAX/long COVID could be 6, 7, 8, 10, 20 conditions. It could be a lot of different things. But I think the theory to beat right now is that this is, viral mediated autoimmunity that is leading to all sorts of different bodily dysfunctions and organ system dysfunctions that we're working on managing. Now, we're at a point, fortunately, where we feel as though we have a rehab program that is producing results and is somewhat successful in helping people resolve their symptoms. But I will also say that some of our patients who have been discharged for the longest are experiencing relapses. So, we need to understand the pathophysiology to understand how long is this going to be going on for? How long are people going to be symptomatic for? Is this something you're going to have to manage for your entire life? Or is this something that you're going to have to manage for the next 5 to 10 years? Or is this something that we can rehabilitate and we'll discharge you and you'll never have to think about it again? So these are all open questions right now.
Yeah, a couple of follow-ups there. When you mentioned using the term PACS in April, do you mean April 2020?
I mean April 2020. Yeah.
Yeah. How many people on your team? Because I'm imagining that you have auxiliary staff that are coordinating appointments, and you have people actually laying their hands on patients and working with them. Then you have researchers that are working more on research. Have you been able to count up members of your team?
I mean, the core team that has just been, absolutely phenomenal and running through all of this. It's like 15, 16 people, or all inclusive of administrators and clinicians and researchers, and just a really phenomenal bunch. There's, I'm sitting here talking to you, but it's these guys that have been doing everything.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And spread across two main clinics?
Two main clinics, yeah.
Yeah. And what do these clinics actually look like? If I were to walk in there, what would I see?
I mean, basically they're big open rooms with various different pieces of equipment, ranging from, robotic tilt tables that allow us to, specifically calibrate exercise for the very, very severe cases, all the way out to treadmills for the people who are getting to the point where we can start pushing them. A bunch of monitoring equipment. So I mentioned capnography, so something that measures how much CO2 is in your breath as you're breathing in and breathing out. Blood pressure cuffs, pulse oximeters. We've got a set of things called Frenzel goggles, which allow us to measure the vestibular system, your balance system, so that we can identify people who have a vestibular episode as we're getting them to change position, because a change in position is often one of the biggest ways to stress your autonomic nervous system, because it's quite a challenging thing logistically to get all of the blood vessels to open and close and blood pressure to regulate as you're moving from sitting to standing. That's actually a really challenging thing to do, that your body does automatically, until a virus or something or some form of trauma knocks it out of balance, and then all of a sudden it forgets how to do that, and and all of a sudden you have all sorts of issues as you're changing positions. So yeah, I mean, it's not a special space. It's just it's the people that make it special.
I was just thinking, did that happen to Yellow Wiggle?
I am not up to date with the Wiggles.
But this is like 20 years ago, I'm sure. I think Greg Page, I think he was the Yellow Wiggle. It was back in the day when my kids were watching the Wiggles. I think he had something like that, where he wasn't able to regulate aspects of his blood pressure and things. So how many patients are kind of on your books, if you can use that term, in terms of how many are you actively treating? How many have you kind of discharged from the program? Do you have any sort of sense of what's come through?
Yeah, so we've distributed through a number of different clinics and settings, and so I would say at any one time we're managing around 400 to 500 patients. We've had about 1,300 people come through and seek care, and I would say that once they get to rehab is a slow process. So we're looking at easily 100 days before we're ready to discharge. I'd say we've at this point successfully discharged a few dozen, so probably 50 or 60, to the point where they're happy to move on. We're happy to let them go. But then, there's a large number of people just still in ongoing rehab.
What do those 100 days kind of look like? I guess they're different for different people, but are you able to give me a sort of an overview of typically what that entails?
Yeah, I mean, really slow, boring, and frustrating paced rehabilitation. The goal of the rehabilitation is to slowly condition the autonomic nervous system to being challenged. So what we're trying to do is just stress the body enough that the body has to react. So your heart rate needs to raise up. Maybe you need to breathe slightly more. Your respiratory rate might increase by 1 breath per minute. We're talking very little. Your body temperature may change slightly, but you're not really doing anything difficult. So that's where we start at. We start at, we start with prehab, which is breath work. So, first things first, we just make sure that everyone is working on the stasis program and just getting their blood gases in a place where they feel like they have their symptoms under control. And then we move to the first step of the rehab program, which usually in most cases involves laying flat on your back. So you're fully recumbent, and we just get gentle leg movements going. At this point, in most cases, our patients aren't, their heart rate isn't stable enough for us to use heart rate as a guide. So we actually use a scale called the Borg scale, which allows you to rate perceived exertion, how hard you think you're working. And, if you think of the scale of, 1 to 10, 0 to 10, where 0 is nothing and 10 is maximal, as hard as you could possibly think you're working, we don't let anyone exceed a 2. So they're laying on their back and they're not reporting being, working harder than a 2 out of 10. And from there, we start to progress based on each person's individual differences. So at this point, it kind of falls apart in me explaining exactly what the program is, but we slowly get people more and more upright. We slowly increase the intensity. We get them to a point where we actually can use their heart rate as a guide. Their heart rate has started to regulate. It's not racing all the time and ramping up and ramping down. It's starting to regulate. So we can now use it as a guide to, pace the exercise the way that we want to. We're now calling it exercise at this point. We're not calling it autonomic conditioning. And then eventually, when we get to day 100 on average, so some people are taking 200 days, some people are taking less. But when we get to the average day of 100, usually they're working at 60 to 80% of their heart rate max. They're, on a treadmill or a bike or whatever is comfortable for them. And they're getting a workout. And that's usually the point where we're like, okay, well, these are all your triggers. These are the behaviors. These are the things to avoid. These are the things to encourage. Keep going with the exercise every day.
So are patients coming in to see someone like every day or every second day? What's the sort of schedule like?
Yeah, we try to do, trying to be conscious of budget, insurance, what insurance will cover. We provide a lot of material, and we try to do twice per week is the most frequent. On occasion, if someone's quite severe, it will be 3 times a week. We try to do from home where possible, because, you just heard what I described, right? Laying flat on your back and moving your legs. All of that is blown out of the water if I'm asking you to leave your apartment and come see me in Manhattan. That's exertion. So, we do our absolute best to try to reduce burden on the patient, both financial and physical. And yeah, we've noticed that there's a few things we've noticed. The first is we're not publishing this protocol publicly just yet. We're working on trying to create that, but right now, in this moment, every time we've tried to do this unsupervised, it's been a disaster. You need a clinician that kind of knows what they're doing and kind of knows how to rehabilitate cases like this, to be watching you in the early days to make sure that you don't overstep, to help you find the right level and so on and so forth. So we haven't been like, here's the protocol, off you go. What we have done instead is lots of education to clinicians all around the country and all around the world to make sure that we, as many clinicians as humanly possible, are educated in the protocol, so that if a patient comes to us who's not in our state or our city or our country, we can say, just put us on the phone with a health professional that you trust, like we're agnostic as to the health professional, and then we walk them through the protocol. We got a video that we use to teach them how to do the protocol. And we've got some reading material about, not just about our protocol, but about like other protocols that are similar that we've found have been successful in the past, but too intense as a starting point for the people that we've been seeing coming in on average.
One of the things that I remember from that Milken thing that you were involved with is just how your patients respond to the fact that you offer them hope, but not in sort of a wishy-washy way, but actually a fairly tangible thing of, well, this is what we're going to try now. And if that doesn't work, we've got something else. And if that doesn't work, we'll try something else. And so you do actually have this sort of stepped phase of the various things that you can offer patients, and how that has really given them a huge elevation. Are you able to sort of talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that's challenging, honestly, treating patients here in the States, one of the things that it can be challenging is medicine's become very hyper specialized here. So although we have some really, hang on just one sec, I've just have to pause you. This automatic, I'm being controlled by robots. This automatic vacuum cleaner has just turned on. I think that it's definitely, as we've started to learn more about this, and as we have successfully rehabilitated some patients, and we're getting some, confidence that what we're doing is at the very least in the right direction. Like I feel really uncomfortable saying that we've worked anything out, because in my opinion, twice weekly PT for 100 days is not really a victory. It's something that seems to be working, but I'm sure we can optimize, and I'm sure that, and we need to optimize, because most people can't do that. Even before that, before we sort of had a handle on how we were going to treat symptoms, what was alarming to me was how, because the medical system is really hyper specialized here, how many people would just be bounced from specialist to specialist without anyone offering a treatment or anyone offering a plan. And it was almost like a game, oh, you got sent to me? No, you've got GI symptoms. Go to, here's the gastroenterologist. You get to the gastroenterologist. Oh, you got a headache? That's a neurology problem. Off you go to the neurologist. Meanwhile, there's a 3-week wait minimum between all of these specialty appointments. Meanwhile, these people's, don't have a job, their insurance is running out, that, the clock's ticking. No one has offered a treatment or a plan or a theory on what's going on. They're just getting bounced around. Often by the time they made it to our clinic, they're so overwrought that, it's a miracle that they're still standing, let alone managing this highly debilitating condition. And so at that point, just being able to say, you know what, this is what we think is going on. And we would always lead with so much uncertainty. Like there was no, this is what's happening to you. It is, here's what we think is going on. It's an entirely novel virus. I can tell you that I've spoken to 1,000 other people who have symptoms just like yours. here's what we think is happening, and here's how we're going to manage a few things in the moment. And if these things don't work, come back to me, because then we're going to try these things. And, and it's just as simple as that. And none of it is certain at all. It's really leading with vulnerability. But all of the patients that we saw would appreciate it so much, to just be like, thank you for not being overconfident. Thank you for not dismissing my symptoms. Thank you for taking a multi-system approach, as opposed to this is my specialty and you're not fitting into any of the neat boxes, so I'm not even going to touch you. And hyper-specializing medicine works out when you're dealing with conditions that you've been treating for hundreds of years. And that's arguably, by the way, as well. It's not even for sure that it works out even then. But when you're dealing with a novel condition, this, practice of medicine where everyone follows protocols and they're hyper-specialized, that's where you start to realize, that's not medicine at all. You're being a robot if that's what you do. And it all falls apart. The whole house of cards comes crumbling down, because suddenly you've forgotten how to fundamentally treat. You've forgotten how to fundamentally say, this is a person sitting in front of me. I'm going to listen to what they're saying, and I'm going to apply my knowledge of physiology to come up with a treatment approach.
David, would you mind just tilting your screen? Yeah, perfect. Sorry, thanks for that. Yeah, because how can you have any expertise in treating these post-COVID symptoms when this is a completely novel and new presentation? So, anything that resembles having expertise is just snake oil in my mind.
Exactly. And I mean, my adage throughout all of this has just been like, to patients and to clinicians and to scientists alike, if anyone tells you that they know what's going on, they're lying to you. Don't trust that person. That's the one person you can't trust, is the person who tells you categorically they know what's going on. And I've certainly seen a lot of clinicians doing that, so you've got one group of clinicians who are paralyzed, right? And they're just like, I'll just refer you on because I don't know what to do with you. And then you've got another cluster of clinicians who are like, oh, you should buy my book and eat my proprietary diet. And, here are all the supplements that you can only get from me. You can't get from Amazon. And, that's the other branch. And they're telling you, they're leaning back, telling you they know exactly what's happening. And as soon as I hear that, I'm just like, all right, get out of here. I know I can't trust you either.
Sorry, David, your chin keeps hitting the bottom of the screen. Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that.
No, all good.
I'm almost done with you. I thought that what you talked about with hypocapnic CO2 tolerance breathwork protocol was fascinating, because that, as you mentioned, that came from a fighter pilot.
No, so a former Navy special ops guy, Josh Dunst. He retired from the Navy. What he did there was he disarmed bombs for a living, so high stress work environment. And he, was very fascinated with this connection between his own well-being and breath work. And he mentioned to me that just through the military community, he had observed individuals who were experiencing similar symptoms to this. He'd seen this sort of symptom cluster before, and it had taken the form of hypocapnia in fighter pilots who had pulled too many Gs and were having a physiological response to that. And their CO2 would drop. They'd get heart palpitations, they'd get dizziness, they'd get these attacks, and so it was something that he had experienced before, he'd seen it before, and he was like, hey, just see what their CO2 levels are doing. And so we got a capnograph and we took a look at their CO2 levels, and sure enough, they weren't dangerously low, but they were solidly below average. Actually, we have some data that we're going to be publishing soon. It's just, it's a significant drop from what we would expect in a healthy population. And so, we said, well, what would you do with a group like this? And he said, well, there's breathwork protocols that will increase CO2 tolerance. So increase your body's just general ability to tolerate a higher CO2 level, because once you've been hypocapnic for a while, if you raise your CO2 levels, you start to pant and get, nervous. And then, he just also developed the protocol to just increase CO2 levels in general. So between those two things, he has a protocol that can coach individuals to slowly raise their CO2 levels. Now, we don't precisely know why CO2 levels are dropping. Again, this leads back to pathophysiology, and it's a bit of a blank slate. But we know that when we increase people's CO2 levels, an edge comes off of their symptoms in most cases. That's, first of all, for prehabilitation, getting people ready to start something. If you can take that edge off, that 10-20% of intensity of your symptoms, that means that they can start something a little bit more exertional, which is helpful for us. The other thing is, and this has just been, relayed to me, it's not me speculating, when patients feel like they can just have some control over their symptoms, so they start to have a symptom attack and they do a breathwork protocol and it brings that attack in faster, so they can rein in their symptoms faster. Psychologically, that's a big deal, just being able to say, I have control over this, as opposed to, I almost fainted and I have no idea why. Like that is a horrifying feeling, to be somewhere public and feel like you're going to pass out and have no understanding of what's happening to your body. You don't want to go to the emergency department for the 5th time, because they're just going to test everything they've already tested, give you an IV for hydration, and then send you on your way with probably a $5,000 bill. And so just being able to be like, okay, these symptoms are coming on. I've had this before. I know what it is. I'm going to sit here. I'm going to do 2 minutes of breathing, and I'm going to feel stable again. That's a big deal.
I'm kind of imagining that the breath work probably involves slowing the pace of your breathing, basically maybe even holding your breath a little bit longer or something like that. And I'm cautious about getting you to talk about that, lest people start listening to this and passing out because they're holding their breath. But is that largely the case, where it's about managing and thinking, being a little bit more conscious of your breathing rhythm?
Yeah, so I mean, there are different, Stasis is a really great group. They've done a lot of research, and the protocols, breathwork protocols are incredibly well researched. Since characters like Wim Hof and others started getting on the scene, people started studying this very hardcore and started really monitoring what it did to your physiology as you were going through these protocols. And so, yeah, in essence, what we're dealing with are changes to the natural rhythm of your breath, changes to the way that you breathe, breathing in through your nose as opposed to breathing in through your mouth, etc. And when you follow some of these protocols, and there's a menu of different protocols you can use, they cause different effects. There's one protocol, for instance, that is called box breathing, which is one of the fastest ways to regulate your parasympathetic nervous system. So it will bring your heart rate down, it will bring your blood pressure down, and it will do it quickly. And so, finding the right breathwork protocol for the right set of symptoms can sometimes be a bit of trial and error, but these things have measurable physiological effects, and so they can be really powerful.
Yeah. Hey, was your clinic the first in the world to be set up to manage these post-COVID patients?
You know, I view people who say we're the first in the world like people who comment on Instagram posts and say first. I don't know if we were the first in the world. I will say that we were probably one of the first.
One of the
we
earliest.
were probably the first on record, saying that we were treating this and having vocabulary to communicate that we were treating this. But I think a lot of groups self-organized around the same time, because a lot of groups who had their finger on the pulse saw what we were seeing, and we've been interacting with so many wonderful people around the country and around the world who have been sharing knowledge, who have understood this is a crisis and we've just all got to work together. So all of that, I don't know, academic and medical competition about who's going to be first or who's going to be best or who's going to be foremost, all of that's out the window. It's like, look, there's more than enough patients to go around. Let's work together to make sure that everyone gets the care they need.
Yeah, and are you actively, well, I guess you're still kind of figuring out protocols and then we'll be publishing on that, but are you already sort of in groups, discussion with the NIH and other CDC, et cetera, to kind of lay out some basic framework for how patients can be helped?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are, involved in multiple groups that are developing consensus guidelines for different health professionals and different specialties. I think it's super important. The communication of these consensus guidelines are going to be super important as well. We're also involved in advocacy groups. We have healthy discussion with a lot of the patient-led groups because, patients are the experts on their symptoms right now. We don't have years and years of literature to have any level of knowledge about what's going on. So really, a lot of it has to be learning from patients.
Yeah. One thing I might do is get in touch with the PR person for the relevant division of Mount Sinai to see if there is any B-roll, because I'm also sort of thinking the sort of typical sounds that you would hear from a session, obviously would want to ensure all the permissions are obtained, etc. But that could be sort of helpful audio color. Do you know who that would be? Do you know who that would be that I would need to get in touch with?
I'll connect you with Ilana Nikrovesh,
Okay.
and I'll try to guide her toward. I know that a couple of guys came down and filmed a session, and so they got releases from patients and all of those good things. So it would definitely be usable. I know they had microphones and booms and things like that as well. So let me I'll connect you with Ilana, and I'll also just sort of point her in the direction of maybe we could ask these people.
Yeah, David, I kept you for an hour and a quarter. Is there anything that you wanted to mention before I let you go?
I think we've covered a lot.
We have. It's been really helpful. I personally, I realize that you are focusing on the patients in front of you and helping them now. My concern as a sort of a medical journalist is what is this going to look like in 20, 30 years when we may be seeing, more interstitial lung disease, dementia, Parkinson's, and neurodegenerative conditions. You have to wonder, but I suspect that's perhaps not something you give a lot of your thinking to when you've got a lot of stuff in front of you right now.
Yeah, trying not to, I think is a good way to think about that. I mean, 100%. I mean, we're seeing this influx of cases right now, and we're focused on that. But in the back of our mind, as I mentioned earlier, some of the open questions are just, if all of these auto antibodies are rushing around people's bodies, and that and suddenly, I don't know, 10% of the people who got acute COVID have autoimmunity. Yeah, what are the long-term implications of that? We need, thankfully the NIH is doing a good job of putting a lot of dollars towards studying that. We need more, and we need more groups than just the NIH, because the NIH does tend to be myopic in both who they fund and what they fund. We need other groups coming in like PCORI, and we need lobbyists to get other groups, from the government, other branches of the government to fund more work, because yeah, this is going to be something that affects a lot of people. We have concerns, the group that we have right now, 60% of them have changed their employment status because of their symptoms. And again, if you dial back to the demographics we were talking about, that's 60% of people, in their prime working years. They're 42 years of age on average. That's not the group that you want who suddenly can't work, suddenly have a cognitive impairment that we need to rehabilitate. These things are really concerning, and we're keeping good records now, and I hope we keep tracking it, and we make sure that everyone gets counted.